line on a rather famous website that a lot of people use. What really was troubling was that the person who wrote that article actually found a source and found that that source was in error with respect to one of the pieces of information, and yet put it online anyway, repeating the errors. And I said, that won't stand. I have done a thorough job of research with more than 400 footnotes in only 146 pages. As a lawyer, we're taught to footnote everything. And it's out there for anybody to check. My information I believe to be quite accurate, and somebody can go behind me and check. Now, things do change. For example, I will picture of a ship. Both of the cited sources are no longer current. So let's start with when and where Abraham was born. He was born in 1822, and by the way, the person who wrote the article, which was copied, put down a wrong date. I found the original record of Abraham's birth and cited it. That won't change. Actually, I got it from the Mormons, and it's a copy on microfilm of the original record, so I'm sure it's correct. Where is Posen? Posen, Abraham was born in what was then Betcha, a very small town which I have visited, and I actually saw the town, the house, maybe not where he was born, but certainly he lived there for a time. It's on the edge of the village. Posen province, or before that Grand Duchy, it became the province in 1850, along with the other 16 old provinces of Prussia, is today in Poland, in western Poland, in Wielkopolska Voivodeship, which means that it's not bordering Germany, it's one voivodeship over to the east from the German border. Abraham was from a family of career criminals. They specialized in theft and in bearing false witness. That was the family business. The women were shoplifters, at least later. And they were all very good at it. So far as I know, at least during Abraham's lifetime, none of the women was actually ever arrested. So that tells you something right there. Abraham, in fact, turned out to have spent more than half of his life in prison. So one has to wonder why he didn't look for another profession. But as I said, it was the family business. He gave an interview in 1871 to The Sun in New York City and boasted that he had never done an honest day's work in his entire life. One wonders why he would have given such an interview, but he did, and of course it had some very negative consequences, as we shall see later. In 1831, his father was arrested along with more than 50 others in Betcha. By the way, today Betcha is Pszczew, P-S-C-C-Z-E-W, Pszczew in Poland. same place. And it was the hideout for the gang. Oh, excuse me. When the German authorities from Berlin came to Betcha and made the arrests, it turned out that the gangs, and I have to say gangs, not gang, had taken over Betcha, so it was actually governed by criminals, and they were responsible for more than 1/3 of the thefts in Berlin. His father was convicted and sent to prison when Abraham was only 8 years old. And he resented it bitterly. He was the sole source of support for his mother and 3 siblings at the time, and got his start by going to the neighboring village of Meseritz, today Mienzerzec, and stealing in the main square. Despite all of that, he knew nothing else as a profession, even though he could, in fact, read and write, although later. And the Prussian authorities arrested him at about the age of 15 for the first time. Not the only time, I would add. As Abraham grew up, he had this penchant for recognition and for respect. Essentially, he was a mafia don before there were mafia dons. He was the one who essentially wrote that code of conduct, as we shall see later. Now, his basic mode of operation was pickpocketing. He was very good at it. Pickpocketing is generally considered by thieves to be the highest form of theft because it requires the most skill. And there was even a school for pickpockets in Betcha, which actually exported tools for pickpocketing and other forms of theft, certainly to Latin America, but also elsewhere, around the world actually. So they never missed an opportunity. The final examination was a mannequin with 12 pockets and bells above each of the 12 pockets. In order to pass the final exam, you had to steal whatever was in the pocket without setting off the bell. Those who did that successfully graduated and I suspect were welcomed into the, quote, fraternity, unquote. There was this large group among the residents of Betcha who were Jewish, but they were not all Jews. There was also a separate but allied gang of Christians. But they got along. And the same happened with Abraham in the United States. He made friends with some of the Irish gangs that we know of, and I suspect with other gangs. Abraham carried a pocket knife, but he never carried a gun, never carried a cudgel, and never used violence except to a very limited extent to try to escape when he was in the process of being arrested. And then simply used his arms, legs, whatever, but nothing more. He was not a violent man. His MO was stealth and skill, not violence. he had a very happy home life, actually. His daughters adored him, and later we'll see what happens as a result of that. Now, he was one of the people who was held up by anti-Semites, especially in New York, but elsewhere, as an example. Yet, my research, based upon newspaper articles, archival matters, and published sources, is very sparing of the discussion of anti-Semitism and his relationship to it. Very sparing indeed. We find very little bit of it at the beginning of his career in the United States, but the newspapers seem to have assiduously avoided connecting him with anti-Semitism, and to be honest, I don't know why they were so reticent, but they certainly were. There were an awful lot of people who watched his doings on virtually a daily basis. Obviously, the newspapers wanted to sell newspapers. And once he's gone from the scene, there's only one other mention that I was ever able to find, and it is in an article by a retired thief in 1912. Abraham died in 1889, so that's quite a long time, and yet there are no articles in the newspapers about him in the interim. Abraham was generally active with his brother and his father, and Abraham was the man who actually invented pickpocketing on trains. Each pickpocket had his own MO, and you could usually tell who it was if he had a past history and you knew what he did and how he did it. In the case of Abraham, he would drop cigar boxes so that the pigeon, if I can say that, that's the victim, couldn't get through the aisle, and that gave Abraham or his confederates the opportunity to use a very small knife to cut the buttons on the waistcoat and get the money that way. Or they would surround the victim, and before he knew what had happened, they had found the money and taken it. And Abraham was very good at picking a mark. He very frequently would steal thousands of dollars at a time, when you could get lunch at Delmonico's, the best restaurant in New York City, for 10 cents. Dinner cost a bit more, but 10 cents at the best restaurant in New York City. And you could get a cold water flat in Lower Manhattan for $4 a week. So stealing thousands of dollars in a few minutes works pretty well, and you can understand why Abraham never did an honest day's work in his entire life. I'm sure that was a true statement. Now, let's get to Abraham's name. The newspaper sometimes referred to him as Abe. He never, ever used that sobriquet. He was always Abraham. Why? Because that was a name given to him according to, quote, God's holy ordinance, unquote. Last names are given by the enemy, the government. And so he feels no compunction about changing that last name anytime he wants, as often as he wants, more often than he changed his underwear. We don't even know for certain what his last name is. In the earliest governmental documents from Prussia, his last name is listed as Leslau with relatives named Greenthal in German. He starts out calling himself Greenthal in the United States, but he also called himself Green, various other names, Myers, Brown, so on. But always Abraham. He never changes that, never. And indeed, I think he regards it reverently. He certainly wants to put on a show of attending the synagogue every Saturday, but how religious he is, I don't know. He certainly makes a distinction between Jews and non-Jews as who should be his victim. He does transgress that. He finds himself in great difficulty, and he never makes that mistake again. We'll come to that in a little while. I told you earlier about the school for pickpockets. It was a matter of some pride that Vienna felt itself less constrained to suffer crime than Berlin. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but there's a famous rhyme. I'll give it to you first in German and then I'll translate it into English because it doesn't rhyme in English. Es gibt nur eine Kaiserstadt. Es gibt nur ein Wien. Es gibt nur ein Räubersnest. Und das heißt Berlin. There is only one imperial city. There's only one Vienna. There's only one nest of robbers, and its name is Berlin. And this was very popular in Vienna, as you might guess. But it gives you some insight into the attitudes of the time and the rivalries. Now, Abraham at one point was accused of stealing a very valuable chronometer from some nobleman whom I have not been able to identify. He was arrested, tried, convicted, and was sentenced to prison in Ravitch. Ravitch is still in existence and still a prison. He had just married his first wife. She was from one of the finest criminal families in Breslau, today Wrocław. She could read and write German. You know, that in itself was a great advantage. And if anything, I think she was smarter than he was, and he was not stupid. He relied on her a great deal. She had the presence of mind to ask, may I accompany him on his trip to prison? She was granted permission. Why, I have no idea, but she was. And she had the presence of mind to bring with her 2 small pots. A young man was assigned to bind his hands and walk him to Ravitch. At one point, nearing Ravitch, his wife offered the man the 2 pots. Guess what was in the 2 pots? Very strong alcohol. He, being young and inexperienced, took them, and she asked him to loosen the bonds, which he did, grateful for the alcohol. And within sight of the town, he escaped into the woods, made his way to Berlin, borrowed some identity documents, we don't know with what name, and made his way to Liverpool, pickpocketing along the way, including in Britain, and bragged that he was never apprehended by the United Kingdom authorities. Undoubtedly true. I made an extensive search, could not find any record of him until he boards the ship in Liverpool for New York. He gets on the U.S. ship Rochus, named after a famous actor, I think in Rome, in ancient Rome, as Mr. Green with his wife, his new bride actually, married less than a year.
Picture.
Oh, yes. Well, you're right. Trying to remember which one it is. There it is.
Lower one.
Whoops. There. No. We'll get there eventually. There. There is the Rochus. And this particular version comes from the National Museum in Greenwich, and it's not in the book because it was first put online after I wrote the book. But I think this one won't be lost as a citation, simply because of the origin. It was perhaps 20 years ahead of its time. It was the forerunner of the Clippers, and it made the trip between Liverpool and New York in record time. He had very good taste and always went first class. By the way, he arrived in New York with $350, although I'm not sure that it was actually in dollars. It may have been in pounds sterling. But he gives the figure of $350, and clearly all of it was stolen. So you get the idea. By the way, not sure I know how to get back to. There we go. Yeah, that is Betcha.
Open it back up.
I'm sorry. From which Abraham came, and would help if I pointed it in the correct direction. You can see that I have shown where the synagogue is and where the Jewish cemetery is. Here is the synagogue, and there is the cemetery right across from probably the oldest part of the town. As I told you, I have been in the place. It's relatively bucolic, shall we say. I don't think I would want to live there even if I could. So, having escaped and gotten on the Rochus, Abraham arrived in New York in 1851 and starts out investing in real property in New Jersey, in an area that today is part of Jersey City. As a matter of fact, whoops, forgive me, there. This is where he lived for a time, very similar to the idea of theft in Berlin, living in Betcha. Most of his thefts occur in either Philadelphia or in New York City, but he makes a point of living in West Hoboken, which is just across the river in New Jersey from New York, and no longer exists as a separate entity. As I said, it's part of Jersey City. he realizes eventually that what may have been good form in Prussia isn't really necessary in New York, and he later moves to New York and stays there. Although occasionally he will practice his trade, if I can call it that, in railway depots in Jersey City. So he's certainly very familiar with it. He always keeps $25 to $35 in his pocket to pay as a bribe in case he is nabbed by a policeman. And many policemen keep their eye out for him, especially in Manhattan, which doesn't have at that time a reputation for honesty, especially in the police force. There was tremendous rivalry between the chief of police and the chief of detectives. Historically, the chief of detectives was quite honest, and let me be silent about the honesty of the chief of police, who frequently dined at the same table with Abraham, often in the house of Mother Mandelbaum, a notorious fence and a rival of Abraham. She is 4'11", the same height as Queen Victoria, but she's 300 pounds. Amazing. Eventually she's arrested and she escapes to Canada, but she is very unhappy about not seeing her daughter, who continues to live in New York. She comes down on the train, and somehow the New York City police never manage to identify her. And she goes back. Eventually she dies in Canada. I don't think you need to be a college graduate to figure out that something's wrong there. And she would have probably driven Abraham out of business as a fence had she remained in New York. She does outlive him. She dies in 1894. She is not, as some of the papers say, a close relative. Not at all. They're strangers to each other. They're from different parts of Germany. But the papers have it that they're close relatives. Well, only in crime. Abraham, like so many others, so many mafiosi who follow him in his tracks, wants to be 100% American in some ways. And so he files a declaration of intention, but doesn't use the same name. So it became extremely difficult to find that, but I did. By the way, it was extremely difficult to find his arrival on the Roshas, because he calls himself Mr. Green, and his wife is only identified as ditto marks, meaning Mrs. Green. He has a very winning personality. That makes him quite successful. And I've already explained to you that what his MO was. He ran something called the Sheeny Gang. Quite nasty word, but it was Jews only and mostly his relatives. And to give you some idea, if one recognized member of the criminal fraternity presented a $250 watch at the door, one of his daughters knew to pay $13 for that without having to ask Daddy. They were very well cared for. They loved him. They knew how to crochet, sing, So whenever they had a gentleman caller, there would always be a chaperone in the room. They knew how to play the piano. Clearly they were striving for some kind of acceptance, despite the fact that they were well recognized as shoplifters. Abraham had one son, Isaac, who died at age 6. He never, ever spoke about him, so it must have hurt a great deal. I've been able to identify the area of the cemetery in which all of these people, including Abraham, are buried, but there are no markers surviving, so I don't know exactly where in the society each of these is buried, plus his mother-in-law and his wife. He is arrested in Poughkeepsie after one job. I'm not going to go into every arrest, trial, etc. If you're interested in that, you can read it in the book. But he spends 8 months in jail, basically trying to arrange a bribe. And he's morally indignant that he has to pay $8,000 in bribes to get out. He determines, therefore, that he will leave the United States. His younger brother, Hirsch, called Herman, is already in Brazil. So he takes a boat to Brazil and arrives there. This was fascinating for me because the United States only kept records of who left the United States from after World War II, at least on a systematic basis. Now, the United States, in fact even before, the United Colonies kept records of who arrived here from British colonial times onward, but not those who left. So how do you find such records? Not easy. But that's why I love the Library of Congress. Wouldn't you know, they had a listing for ships arriving in Brazil from 1865 to 1890. And on page 4 of the book, there he is with his wife and daughters. And the library even had I think it was 12-page translation, horrible translation into English, from the Portuguese, explaining the meaning of the columns. Again, even if you don't speak Portuguese, it's easy to figure out what's going on. All you have to do is go to the index, look up the name, see if it's there. If it is, go to the page indicated. It isn't rocket science. But that's why I love the Library of Congress. It's just so comprehensive. They don't have everything, but they've got an awful lot. Now, once he gets to Brazil, he plans a caper. But it goes awry. His brother is arrested, and he grabs a ship as fast as he can, first to Recife in Brazil. I have been there, didn't find a whole lot. And today, in fact, what I did find is online. I wouldn't have had to go there. It wasn't online at the time. And from Recife, he takes another ship to New York. And that's relatively easy because that's coming into the United States, and that's easily found using traditional sources. So then he's back in New York City waiting for his brother to finish his term, 5 years at hard labor in a Brazilian prison. And of all of the lists of arrests in the Rio de Janeiro press, his was the brother, was the only one that didn't identify the accused. I presume that the reason is, as some Brazilian archivist told me, that's because whoever the victim was very high ranking, probably a member of the emperor's cabinet. And so neither the victim nor the accused is identified. As I said, every other entry that I could find from some days before, through that day, and through subsequent days, shows the accused identified, not in this particular case. So keep in mind, when you're doing genealogical research, everything, including a negative, is a clue. And there's almost always some grain of truth in those stories that you hear from the family. You just have to interpret it correctly. I asked my mother at one point, where was the family from? And she named a location. Turned out to be absolutely wrong. It was a street by that name in Berlin. But there was the clue. At least it was the right street name, even though it wasn't the right location. So I think you get the general idea. You have to be careful when doing that. Back in New York, he steals 12 live geese.
Why? At Christmas.
No, I don't think so. It's while he's, I think, trying to get back on his feet in New York. I don't know exactly why the Poughkeepsie police didn't pick up on it, but maybe they had been bribed sufficiently that they didn't pursue the matter. But he gets caught. He has stolen from a Jew. It's the only time he does that I can find. When he's arrested, he accuses the man of rape. The judge is having none of it because the victim, who's operating a grocery general store, was observed at the very time he's accused of rape of being in the synagogue praying. And the Christian judge makes a big thing of that and adds to Abraham's sentence. Again, he's learned he never, ever again accuses a Jew, and he never talks about rape again. So he does learn. Remember, he's pretty clever, and he certainly learned that lesson. He arrives in 1851. He himself says, and so far as I can tell, it's accurate, he doesn't come to the notice of the U.S. authorities until approximately 1859. So he's managed to do pretty well. Hello?
No, you gotta wait a minute,
Ah.
Marshall. Yeah, stop clicking.
There it is.
Yeah.
Here he is in 1857. He's a pretty good looking guy, I think. That's his brother over there on the right. That's Herman, or Hirsch. The brains is Abraham, and it's Hirsch who carries out the robberies, etc. They have a very close relationship, and I'll come to that later.
Looks like something. Yes, it is.
Abraham, when he gets arrested, has a habit of skipping bail. So he'll forfeit either the $1,000 or $1,500 he's put up, or at least the deposit on the bail and whatever else is involved. And he sails for Europe, or he gets the accuser to sail for Europe so that he's not available at trial. That's his typical way of handling such issues. Why he gave a, at one point, he decides he wants to bring a libel suit against a newspaper, probably the New York Sun, and goes to the judge, who he asks to issue an order allowing him to bring a suit. Now, that's not required under US law, but it is required under civil law in Europe. And apparently he did not consult an attorney here. Amazingly, the judge knows the law, which surprised the hell out of me, because most political appointees in this country, especially at that time when they were Tammany Hall appointees, didn't know much law. The professor who prepared me for the New York bar referred to them as, quote, a dim lot, unquote, and he was the one who prepared them. And in my experience, that's generally true. There are some stellar standouts, but most judges have to be led by the attorneys. In any event, he asks for an order, and the judge rather wisely asks, well, what did they say? And Abraham replies, they called me a thief. Keep in mind, this is a man who has not only been convicted, but served time in jail for that. So the judge finally tells Abraham, I'm not going to give you such an order. And that's the end of it for some reason. Abraham doesn't pursue it further. Again, remember, under US law, there was no need for such an order, but Abraham apparently doesn't know that. In any event, he then gives that interview, which, as we shall see later, has quite important consequences. I want to, at this point, read something to you. Where Abraham has been convicted of a crime, and here is, oh dear, here is the judge's explanation. One moment. The case having been tried in the Court of General Sessions on the first Monday in December 1871, Abraham Greenthal, alias Abraham Greenthal, was convicted by the jury. The judge stated that it was a matter of official satisfaction to him to at last have an opportunity of meting out justice to so notorious an offender against the laws of God and man as he was. Meaning Greenthal. He was one of the most skillful thieves that ever disgraced this or any other country, and to rid society of such a dangerous and degraded criminal, he would send him to the state prison for 5 years, the highest penalty allowed by statute. So he had quite a reputation. And I think that the judges did what was expected of them, but having been convicted only of a crime of that level, he could only be sent at that time to prison for 5 years. When the article was published in the New York Sun, apparently one of the members of the Christie Street Synagogue, as it was known, read the article and brought it to the attention of the president of the synagogue, who then brought it to the attention of the board. That being the case, twice the board of directors voted to exclude Abraham from membership, meaning that they would not take his dues, and they confiscated the pews he had purchased, one for himself and one for his female members of the family, presumably upstairs, and also were unwilling to take him back unless he lived, as they said, quietly for several years. That, of course, was not something Abraham was going to do. So what did he do? He sued to get his property back and to force the synagogue to accept his dues. The matter went to appeal, and in both cases, the courts in New York held that any religious institution had the right to remove a member who violated their moral code, provided it was within the general moral view of society. And so Abraham lost ignominiously, and by the way, that holding is still good law, certainly in New York and probably throughout the common law world. So of course it's not good law in Scotland, which uses uncodified civil law. I know that there's present here someone from Italy who will recognize that rule, but everywhere else where the English common law holds sway, probably, for example, in New Zealand or Australia, the case would come out the same way. So maybe Abraham's judgment wasn't so good in pursuing such a matter. I certainly would have advised him not to test whether that was the right thing. The congregation had taken away his rights while he was in Sing Sing, and when he came back, he had tried to pay the dues and they wouldn't accept it. They wouldn't allow him to vote, but they did say that members of his family would be allowed to be buried in the synagogue's plot in a cemetery where they had bought land, and also he could worship on Saturdays free of charge, so long as he sat in pews that he and his family sat in pews that were assigned by the president. And as it turned out, they assigned pews immediately next to the ones he had formerly had. And the court said, well, of course that's good enough. In fact, it was more generous than what they had to offer him, if anything. In the meantime, he spends time in Auburn State Prison, and he's not in the greatest of health when he's released in 1872. It almost reminds me of the situation, perhaps some of you are familiar with Gilbert and Sullivan, the Pirates of Penzance, and the talk, or the song rather, A Policeman's Lot Is Not a Happy One, they could have had Abraham in mind. They didn't. I checked. He was in prison at the time, so he didn't attend, but easily he could have seen himself in a way in that. At this point, once he gets out of prison, he engages the best of the attorneys in New York, Howe and Hummel. One day there was a survey of, I think it was 24 persons in the Tombs, which is the jail in which persons accused of crimes and not yet convicted in New York are held. Of the 24 men in the Tombs, 23 and accused of murder, have engaged Howe and Hummel to be their counsel. They're the most expensive counsel, of course, in New York because they're the ones most likely to win. And the 24th admits that he didn't hire them because he cannot afford their fee. So it tells you something about Howe and Hummel. I can't go into, we don't have time, I can't go into their history, but it's also a fascinating history. And if you look in the book, you'll see a reference to a book written by someone whom I knew personally, who wrote about them. When Abraham is in prison, he tries to get out through Howe and Hummel, and he engages A. Oakley Hall, the former and particularly venal ex-mayor of New York, to argue on his behalf. They're quite successful eventually, and there's a declaration that the judge who convened the grand jury and held them over acted illegally. And so, for probably the first time in history, the Court of Appeals decides that he has to be resentenced and take that time that he served in jail into account. It's the first time it happens, and again, it's still good law in New York. At the last minute, by the way, he had decided to change his plea from not guilty to guilty. And so he got 1.5 years sentence. When he was transferred from Auburn to Sing Sing, they transferred him with a large number of other prisoners and confiscated a pocket knife, a snuff box, and 6 French rolls. He had been a cook, and so that was considered a plum job in prison. And even, by the way, even the warden was respectful of him. It showed how much power he had. He's known to have helped quell one riot, and we don't know how many others never even reached, for example, the notice of the warden, because he stopped them. He was not violent, and not only not violent, but he encouraged others not to be violent, even in prison. He had regular visitors, even though there was supposed to be only 2 visits a month, and then from family members other than the lawyers. But he continually flouted that and got away with it. Again, it shows how powerful he was in prison. It's interesting that, as I told you earlier, there was very little indication of anti-Semitism in the U.S. papers. And by the way, it was all over the country, even onto the West Coast, that they would pick up the stories about him. Only in a London paper did I find some unconscious anti-Semitism creeping in to the story, indicating that certain characteristics were usual in, quote, that race, unquote, meaning Jews, of course. It's really kind of disheartening in a way, but I think that, in fact, it was actually worse than what was portrayed. Now, when he was arrested in 1877 in Rochester for a theft, his whole family showed up in court and created a number of scenes in order to try to divert the judge, the jury, whatever. And so it didn't work, but it would make a wonderful scene in a movie. Let's put it that way. He was sentenced to 20 years at hard labor in Auburn, and that's when this picture was taken, along with that of his brother, who was also involved in the crime. Two of his four daughters worked tirelessly to get him pardoned, and eventually managed to get Grover Cleveland, governor of New York, but already president-elect, to not pardon him, but to commute his sentence. The Republican papers were having none of that. They insisted on calling it a pardon, which it was not. His rights were not restored. He was still a criminal. That's what commutation is about. The governor decided when he should be released and under what terms. And the terms, of course, were he was to carry with him the stigma. So we're kind of short on time, so I will skip some of this. He had said, by the way, that he would live quietly in Salt Lake City with his sister. He never went there. He probably had no intention of doing that. Not, I think, 3 weeks after he got out of prison, he was again arrested in a New Jersey depot. In a Brooklyn depot. And that was a major mistake, because Brooklyn, a separate city from New York City, had a reputation for, one, being Republican, not Democratic, and two, being honest. They don't necessarily go together, but they did in this case. And the judge sentenced him to 20 years for the crime. He was let out 3 weeks before he died. He was obviously already terminally ill. And the newspapers say that he died in his sister's house, but that cannot be true. She was already dead. And the other one was in Salt Lake City. So it must have been one of his daughters. 2 of his daughters went straight. The other 2 were career criminals with reputations themselves. And it's much easier. There's a whole chapter on the genealogy of the family, and it's much easier to trace the ones who went straight. The crooked ones changed their names, etc. It made it very difficult, sometimes impossible, to trace them. It's something to keep in mind if you're trying to do that. I just want to give you one name that I think is interesting. One of his associates, also a relative, was Bendig or Wolf Getz, the cockroach. That was his name in the criminal fraternity. By the way, when news came of the sentence for Abraham, his brother had nervous prostration to the extent that he actually died. The relationship was that close. I'll skip the story about his second wife, who was 18 when he was 68 or 69. His daughters were, of course, opposed to that, and I cannot find information about her. I think that what was going on was that she herself was from a criminal family, and when she found out that he didn't have any money left because of his time in prison, she wanted out. She got an annulment while he was in prison, and she's never heard of again. Now, the whole era was one of corruption. This is the time of the Tweed Gang, or the Tweed Ring. Some of you will have heard of that. And the question in my mind is, well, why didn't he go straight? He didn't know any other profession.
Anything else?
Pardon?
He didn't know anything else.
That's right. I guess I'm ready for any questions. I've been talking for 1 hour and 1 minute.
How old was he when he died?
Well, if he was born in 1822 and died in 1889, you can do the calculations.
67.
But he himself gives various ages. So it's not only names he changes, but how old he is.
What was the relevance to the Hoboken when New York was the main part of the city? Hoboken was like a...
No, this was West Hoboken,
it's
which
not-
doesn't exist anymore. It's part of Jersey City.
Okay.
And I think he's replicating Betcha compared to Berlin. Finally, he realizes that that isn't necessary. He might as well just live on the Lower East Side.
Okay.
I want to know how the family was identified in records overseas. I mean, if they were from a family of criminals, every record I've seen has identified the occupation, say, of the parents when the child was born, or the groom. What do they call a career criminal in terms of in the vital records?
No, they never put that down.
What they?
What they would say would be something like peddler or something like that. In the American records, too.
Okay.
He's listed in city directories as a peddler.
The two pictures say alias General Greenthal. Was that like general in terms of the leader of a gang, or?
Exactly. His associates called him that as a term of respect, and he had a reputation for keeping his subordinates in line, managing them very carefully. But keep in mind, they could have gone to another gang or something like that. So obviously, it was a good relationship, and this sobriquet was a term of honor in a sense, if you will, honor among thieves. Yes, ma'am.
What are your favorite resources for researching folks with criminal records? I have a relative by marriage on my mother's side, my maternal grandfather's side of the family, who I know died at the hand of a disgruntled customer. He was a bookie. And I have a newspaper record of that from several sources, but I'm having trouble sort of piecing the story before that together. So what are some of your favorite resources to go to?
Old Fulton postcards.
I've tried Old Fulton.
Ron Aaron's if the issue is late enough,
Okay,
depends on when.
he died in 1947.
Yes, then Aaron's would be a possibility, if he,
Okay.
in New York anyway.
Yeah, he was in New York.
Okay, so did he go to Sing Sing or Auburn?
I believe before he was killed, he was at Dannemora for some time, but I'm not completely sure.
Well, I don't know if, see, Aaron's is a little bit late for me, so I don't know if he covers Dannemora or not, but you would certainly want to try.
Okay.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
At the end, the last conviction, you said he was caught in the terminal, which suggests he was actually out being a pickpocket.
Oh, yes.
But for the earlier convictions, was he actually caught as a pickpocket, or did they come to his house and discover stuff, or what?
Normally, he would have been arrested on site where the crime was committed, or they would come after him later. When they would search his house, they would sometimes find stolen goods, things like that. But I think that they didn't come to the house without reason. There was a New Jersey statute, almost certainly unconstitutional, where people could be detained based upon their reputation. And I'm not sure what happened to that statute. I'm pretty sure that it's not in force in New Jersey today. And I would say that even at the time, it probably was unconstitutional. Yes, sir.
Oh, Ed, could you tell us a little bit about how you market this book, who your publisher is, or somebody would buy it? And secondly,
Yeah,
whether you think it has any possibility for somebody picking it up.
please.
Your movie right, this is a good story, movie rights, something like that.
I would love that. Nobody has approached me. If anybody here knows of somebody,
But I mean,
I
are you reaching out at all? Do you do that as part of your marketing?
haven't tried to market it. This book is available free of charge and anonymously online. Anybody can read it. It is copyrighted, however, so somebody would have to come to me to produce.
It's not available in a hard copy?
No, sir, but you could print it out on your computer if you wish. But if anybody in this audience knows of anyone who wants to make a movie, I would just like to have the part of President-elect Grover Cleveland. No speaking. Yes, ma'am?
So suppose somebody has something like this that they discover as they're going, how would they record, how would you expect that they would keep it in their genealogy so that generations going forward might see it? I mean, are there still people in his family now? Would they know? Would they want to?
I have not
this?
tried to contact anybody on the theory that, one, I'm not sure who they are, and two, they might be a bit upset.
Well,
But
but suppose, somebody else discovers it in their own family, not his story, but a story like this. How do people choose to either include or make it available to subsequent generations, even if not during their own lifetime?
well, one of the things you could do, of course, is give it to the Center for Jewish History or Leo Beck Institute or YIVO, whichever is the most appropriate in your case. And the other thing, of course, is to do what I did and put it online. I would just say that there are organizations, such as the ones that I've named, those are not the only ones, that would be very interested in any genealogical research that any of you has done, and would be more than happy to include it in their archives. And you ought to consider, with respect to documents in support, of either making photocopies or sending the originals to one or more such institutions. And you'll forgive me as a lawyer, if you haven't created a will, you certainly should. If you're worth more than $600,000, you should be talking to an attorney about creating a revocable living trust, and either or both of those should provide for the disposition of your genealogical research.
And so all of your sources though, I mean, you were mentioning, for instance, with the ship, that it came online after.
The Rashas, yes.
Yes, and that the data, of course, came from the Royal Museums in Greenwich, so. are
Yeah, that
all of
was
your
later, I've
sources-
only just discovered that last
Yeah.
week.
But what I'm saying then is, all of the sources that you've cited essentially are in some way publicly available, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So,
Um,
so basically what you.
I
did
went
is
to the
tie
New
them
York State
together.
Archives, for example. It's crazy. The New York State Archives, by law, cannot charge you for research. The municipal archives in New York City can, but not the New York State Archives. And so when they found some items, they charged me 25 cents per page, with a minimum charge, I think, of $5. And so this tremendous amount of research that I got, especially with respect to prisons, and it cost me, I think, a total of $6.25.
So they just charge for the copies.
That, technically, yes.
Yeah.
But I did have to pay a little bit extra because it didn't come to 25 cents a page.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah. So, let me just say that I sent that check in record time.
I don't want them to change their mind.
Right. And I wanted the stuff as fast as possible as well.
Did the New York State Archives require you to go there?
No, I did this entirely
You can
by
research-
mail,
okay.
but,
Not online.
well, yeah, by email.
Yeah.
And one of the problems was that apparently somebody doesn't understand that the New York State Archives has blocked Hotmail, so you have to talk to them via Yahoo or Gmail, etc. I tried via Hotmail and they never got it. I tried by Yahoo and they got it immediately, instantly. So, moral, try more than one method of getting to them.
Because when I tried to get something from them, they wanted to know if I could tell them which boxes they were in.
Well, that, I would have
If you
tried,
gave me the index, I could find it, but you won't give me the index.
oh no, the
We
index
went
is
in
online.
circles with them.
The
Okay.
index is online,
Okay.
so try again looking for the index. But I was never asked that question, they did that
Really,
research.
they want to know what box.
Okay.
Anything else? If not, I thank you very much for being so
We appreciate you coming today and